mode.
Good evening everyone, it's Martyn here. Welcome to the Scope Disability webinar series. This is webinar number 2, the teenage years. I know from experience of a couple of weeks ago where we did the early years, which was very much targeted of parents of a disabled child. I think there might be a bit more of a mixture of actual teenagers with a disability attending, but also some parents as well who are obviously still interested in their child's development through those teenage years. I also know that last time a couple of professionals attended as well, so I'll make sure that when we do some of the interactive parts that it's not assuming it is a disabled teenager that's on the other end of the webinar, but it's a more broader sort of interactivity, so whatever your background is you'll be able to participate and hopefully take lots of helpful things away. So I'll say welcome to the actual webinar. If it's the first time you've logged on, I hope the sort of technology is working out okay for you. As you can see, the slide should be up on your screen, which is the slide that's on my screen. And as I then change the slide over like that, that should change on your screen too. And then there's a chat box, I believe, to the right-hand side. But anyway, there's a chat box somewhere on your functions that you can type in. So by all means, if you want to write me a little welcome message, then happily go ahead and do that, and I'll know that you found the chat box and that you can communicate with me throughout. So just type a little hello or wherever you're dialing in from, whatever, just so I know that you're on board. But otherwise, I think let me know if there is any issues with the sound or the technology, and I'll assume all is okay, and then there'll be a couple of times where I'll get you to type into the chat box for an interactive part, and also later on there'll be a poll as well, which 2 weeks ago I did for the first time, and I was so pleased how well it had worked, but I forgot to take the poll down, so the rest of the presentation and the slides weren't actually seen by anyone. The poll stayed up for the remainder, so I'll try and get that one cracked this time. So the general format is that I'll present for about 40 minutes around the sort of different things we'll go through, the bullet points that we'll cover in a moment, and then there'll be some time at the end for question and answers, and that's often I think really the most valuable part, where you can ask me more specific things as well. So thanks for the welcome messages. Good to see you all settled in and looking forward to the presentation. So I hope you can take lots of helpful things away with you at the end, and obviously if anything pops into mind afterwards, then I'll leave you with my contact details, and also I'm going to signpost you to the Scope Response helpline as well. So I think that the crux of the presentation here is very much about my personal experiences of disability and around a theory that I've kind of created over the time I've been blogging and using new media to try and sort of give disabled people more aspirational messages. But then obviously when there's much more intricate issues or problems that you might be having, then Scope Response to the professionals that have a lot more experience on other impairments as well. So between my personal experiences and Scope's general experience, and I'm sure we can help on specific issues. But let's fire off through the presentation anyway. So for those that were on a couple of weeks ago, the introduction and the diamond theory will be quite similar, so apologies if you have heard it, but it will just reiterate what we went through a couple of weeks ago. And for those who haven't been on before, then here's a little cheesy picture of the guy on the other end presenting to you at the moment, if you haven't seen me before. As I said a couple of weeks ago as well, that picture was taken in Scope's head office when I worked there for 5 years in a couple of different roles actually, but mainly up in the fundraising team. So my personal experiences are that I'm disabled. I have SMA, which is spinal muscular atrophy, so I use an electric wheelchair and have full-time care. I have a master's degree from university. I live independently in London with my care team. Have quite a hectic social life, although having turned 28 a month ago, as you can well imagine, I'm slowing down a bit now. Not. World traveller, so the webinar that I presented last Wednesday through my blog actually was from New York. I had a week away with 2 other guys with SMA, and we basically went for a holiday, but we did meet up with some interesting groups of people around disability and social media, and it all helped towards the work I'm doing at the moment as well. And I have lots more cool plans for life too. So that's a broad snapshot of my personal experiences. Professionally, work experience we're going to touch upon with the teenage years, because it's a good sort of period, I think, to get a bit of work experience under your belt. And for me, it was working a local leisure centre, working as a estate agent, and also on a civil service fast track scheme. That was all work experience that I did sort of before and during uni. And then actual paid work, my first ever job was straight out of university, straight at Scope, as I say, where I was a fundraiser, but I also did training, campaigning, media work. I did a lot of research and various other bits and bobs in my time there. Freelance journalist, so I've written for Disability Now a few times and various other online publications. I've been the personalisation ambassador with Hackney Council, and that's led on to me running one of these series of webinars for their service users as well. And as I mentioned, a lot around social media and new media, such as this webinar capability. And then the present day, I'm running my own social enterprise, which is called Sunnier Days, and I'm aiming to change the world for disabled people using social and new media and combining all of the above. So that's a little intro to myself. And more importantly, this is for you guys and the outcomes I hope you take away with you. So we're going to look at why being disabled makes this age harder, hear how I personally overcame my teen years, when to use professional advice, support and assistance, how you can still have a great time as a teenager, because I think a lot of what I try and communicate across is about mindset really as well. And if there's a perception that if you have a disability, not just as a teenager, at any age really, then things are going to be harder and more difficult and not as possible to live an included, action-packed life if that's what you so choose. And so I'm here to tell a few anecdotes as well of the teenage years I had with quite a severe disability I've had since birth, and yet how I was able to still, live the good life as much as all my other friends at school and where I lived did too. And therefore we're going to look at why the sky's the limit and the world is your oyster. So as I said, there's the contact number and email for Scope Response. I'll give that again at the end, and that's where you can make a judgment call if you want to ask me something personally about what I've been through, or whether there's something a bit more intricate that the great guys at Scope Response would be able to help you with. So what we'll cover in more detail really here is the diamond theory, so that will all be revealed in a moment, and then how the theory actually applies to this topic. We're going to consider the barriers that are relevant to you, find some solutions for education, work experience and socialising, and as I said at the end, there'll be the question and answer session. So as I said, apologies for those that have seen this before, but I'll maybe be a little bit more brisk for those that have heard it, but still just give an overarching explanation for those that haven't. So essentially, when I was writing my blogs and creating the webinar topics, I realised that there was an element of chronology to the assistance that people needed. So when a child is born and then probably diagnosed with a disability, although obviously disability can be acquired in later life as well, but assuming like someone like myself, it was from birth and diagnosed very early on, then clearly it's much more around the parents who have to identify the problems towards progression and then find solutions, as the child is just too young to really understand and comprehend that. And as you move into the teenage years, as I said earlier, I think there's a kind of bridging moment where it's 50-50 between the parents and the teenagers to identify all the different problems, find the solutions and really communicate with each other. And we'll touch on this a lot throughout the next half an hour, 45 minutes. And then once you've been through the sort of the children, child, younger years, and you come into adulthood, that sort of transition stage, independent living really is all about finding employment, getting your own housing, having the right equipment spelled correctly. I was convinced I'd change that to the one that's in the actual ebook, but apologies, that T is still crept into equipment. So the right equipment and transport, and of course personal care. And one of the actual whole webinar topics is on personal care. That's independent living part 2, and then independent living part 1, which is a fortnight today covers employment, housing, equipment and transport. And so really as you go up the diamond and you're going through life, there's more and more sort of, I suppose, areas in life to crack. And it's not that it has to be one before the other, or you can't get higher up the diamond without everything completed below, but it just helps to identify the areas within life that need looking at and understanding and then overcoming. And then really I also looked at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how we're all looking towards fulfillment and self-actualization. And that came down to, again, probably from very personal experience, but I know talking to a lot of my disabled friends as well, that there's then looking to progress in their career. So it's not just about having a job and feeling sort of almost, satisfied that you're just in employment. It should be about doing a job that you love and you have passion for, and that, you can feel that you're progressing and learning and, ideally making a higher wage as well. And then that would obviously pay for a better leisure time, so going for coffee and cinema and doing sort of more local everyday leisure activities, maybe going to a sporting event or a concert. And then adventure and travel, so for example for myself would be, obviously I went to New York last week, and I've been to Australia and Mexico, various places in Europe, and had a pretty good travel time. But also adventure, so for example last summer, there's a video of this on my website, I flew an adapted aeroplane, which was an amazing experience. As you can imagine, I think my face was say it all, and Vicky, who's I know is logged on today, I remember talking to her about it, and I think she mentioned how my face just spoke 1,000 words when I landed that plane. It was an amazing experience. So, very aware that different people have different impairments, different problems in the way, and different things they're trying to choose where they want to go in life. But I hope that most of the things in the diamond encapsulate the broader parts of life. And then so the idea is, the philosophy to apply at the top left is to set aspirational goals, identify the barriers, find the solutions, and then grab life. And then I've created sort of 6 resources that help you to do all of that. One is very much around knowledge, so just knowing what the goals are and what the barriers are and where to find the answers. The mindset is very much around can-do, positivity, resilience. People is about valuing friendships and family, and also professionals as well. Technology, so my electric wheelchair, my adapted car, my hoist, they're all vital pieces of technology that enable me to overcome the barriers that I face. Funding, obviously money is important, and I say I'll go into a lot more detail in the actual book I've written on this, but it just gives a framework for us to work through when we head on into the teenage years, and you'll understand more where this comes from. So funding is obviously having the money to access people that can help you, such as carers, personal assistants, and also to fund equipment. And then lastly, campaigns. So when there's no other avenues or policies or funding to help get towards that goal and overcome the problems, then often there's a campaign, around changing a policy in a school or a workplace and things like that. So by all means, download the ebook on the link below and have a good read and let me know what you think afterwards. But we'll press on now and apply it to those teenage years. So the way I see it is there's sort of 3 teenage goals which won the diamond, and that's education, work experience, and social activities. Now, looking at education, there's a lot of similarities for those that were there 2 weeks ago as well. I think I even touched upon my secondary school. And really it's sort of around in those teenage years, it's all about being included, as I say at the top, but appropriately supported. So I think utopia is full inclusion, but equally when an individual has a disability and has many needs that need to be supported due to their disability, then it's about a kind of balancing act that if putting someone in an included environment is going to mean that they're not going to have the right physical or learning support, then there needs to be a call on that. And there's a lot of interesting debate 2 weeks ago about mainstream versus special schools. It was really good. So by all means, if you haven't seen the video of 2 weeks ago, I can send that to you if you want it, emailing through afterwards. So for me, during the education is, I'll go into a bit more detail, but I sort of pulled out an example here, which is being at the local school. but with access to physio and swimming. So having access to the right level of the curriculum, and ideally being with other friends that maybe aren't all disabled, so there's an element of inclusion, but that there is a unit or people around that can help with doing physiotherapy to maintain physical well-being and swimming as well. So we touched a lot on that, whereas the other two are a little bit newer or probably a bit more different into the teenage years. One being work experience. So again, the ideal would be being in a local business, but being fully able to complete the tasks. So for me, when I was struggling, I obviously couldn't, work behind a bar or in manual labour. It had to be a bit more desk-based, so I had to understand my limitations. I went down into the local town centre where I grew up and just went round various businesses that I thought beforehand would probably work out okay, and just asked around, and was lucky enough that there was a really cool estate agent, for example, that took me on board, and it was only about an afternoon a week during the summer holidays, but it was a great example of just getting some work on my CV. So I say, if you have particular questions, we'll go through it at the end. There's a couple of things coming through for clarification, but I may well touch upon it in the next few slides anyway, so I'll come back to those questions at the end. And then finally, with social activities, so things like going out to the cinema with friends or going to a party with your friends, I think are a lot more important in the teenage years. I think in the younger years, it's probably broadly about maybe family inclusion. So when there's a 5-year-old child with a disability, there'd be more issues around the whole family meeting up with local friends in the community and going to bigger birthday parties where the parents interact. And I know many of the parents 2 weeks ago were inquiring about how I and my family manage that. Whereas I think coming into the teenage years, it becomes more and more about the child being independent and finding the ways that they can go to places like the cinema and parties without necessarily having mum and dad there all the time. But then, as we said before, equally having the appropriate support. So that broadly brings us through the 3 goals, the utopia of inclusion, but the necessity for having the ideal support. So I hope that puts it in a bit more general context. So as we said, once we know what those goals are, it's about defining the barriers. So I've got a little bit of a definition, which I'll read it out, which is that a barrier is anything that prevents a person with a disability from fully participating in all aspects of society because of his or her disability, including an architectural barrier, a physical barrier, an informational communications barrier, an attitudinal barrier, a technological barrier, policy or practice. So the word barrier does come up a few times. From the training I did at Scope around the social model, that can be simplified really into 3 areas, which are physical barriers, attitudinal barriers, and organisational barriers. So we'll touch on the next slide, but the reason I'm just giving it a bit more context is at the bottom you can see that I want you guys to actually write in your chat box and have a bit of a think and start applying this whole diamond theory goal stuff to you or your family member or as a professional, how you would imagine it to be applied. So if you write in the chat box, we're going to go education, work and social, and next to each one just put one specific barrier, so not that it's physical or attitudinal, but the actual example of what would be stopping you or your family member or someone you've worked with from accessing the right level of education, work experience and social. So write in the chat box if that doesn't make sense and needs clarifying a bit more, but otherwise I'll give you a minute to have a bit of a think and write down a specific example barrier for each of those 3 goals, just to get you thinking a little bit more about that. I'll just mute it for like 20 seconds, just while you have a bit of a think and start typing as well. Okay, so we've had one come in so far. Remember, it's one for each of the goals. So that's education and for work and for social. So it's a particular example of a barrier for each of those. There we go. There's a few more coming in now. So don't be shy. Get typing away. And obviously, if there's anything you do want to say but don't want to have your name or attached to it or it read out, then you can flag that up to me. But the way that it works is I think it's good to share what everyone's saying out there so you can kind of all feel part of the group. It's a bit like we're in a training room just via the internet, and then the video is always passworded as well. So yeah, that will go out afterwards. So don't be shy either. So let's have I'll start reading out a couple of them. We won't go through all of them, but Alison is saying with education, the TA can't use the talker. So I assume that would be around the technological device for Alison. I think Alison was on 2 weeks ago, so I assume that would be for your child, Alison. So yeah, if the staff at the school don't have the right training to be able to help the technology that can support a person with a disability at school, and that's going to be an absolutely massive barrier. I wonder if that would be attitudinal barrier or organisational barrier, because it depends if the TA is not sort of feeling inclined to want to learn about it, or if there's not been the training provided at the school. It'd be interesting to think which way around that one is, Alison. And obviously if that is something that has happened or is happening, then that the clear aspect would be to overcome the barrier by then finding out why that problem occurs, and then it would be talking to that TA or to the school or to someone else that can provide the right training. So that would be the solution as well. Vicky saying, how a young person with a physical impairment who is not used to travelling independently can meet their friends without the need of adults being around. Yeah, absolutely. I think most parents would always be worried and scared of their child going off on their own at, I say, a younger age, probably any age. I mean, I still at 28 need to check in with my mum wherever I go, especially travelling away, so she knows that I'm okay. So that one's one of those typical examples I give where every parent will worry, and that's absolutely natural, and a parent of a disabled child will worry a bit more because of the additional needs, but overall the child still needs to be able to go out and interact with their friends independently. So I think that's a real tricky one, and I think it always comes back to the individual circumstance of what the person's impairment is, what the barriers are to overcoming to achieve that, and then trying to find solutions using some of the resources that I went through before. So I don't know if you have any thoughts, Vicky, on some solutions. I feel happy to share those, but I think for me it probably would originally have been maybe being dropped off and picked up by a parent, sort of in terms of overcoming the travel, and then knowing that the friendship group, one or two at least of the friends, were sort of mature and knowledgeable and able enough to actually help with the needs of that disabled teenager. So for me, if I was able to get there and then be picked up, and a couple of my friends were able to help me get to the toilet or to get a drink and open food or whatever it might be, that would of course make it a bit more doable, but it's always trial and error, I think. We've got another one saying about work, so having steps in, so that would be a physical barrier, definitely would be, if the office or wherever the place of work would be would have steps in, then someone in a wheelchair would not be able to get up those steps and be able to access that area. We touched upon transport, a couple of others around money. I mean, I suppose that's, again, if that would be disability related or not, but I know if, for example, public transport doesn't work, so maybe a taxi is the only answer, but it will cost more, then funding that trip is going to be a bigger barrier than if that person wasn't disabled. And again, a solution might be, it could have to be even just saving up and doing that trip less regularly, but it could also be about talking to social worker about ways of helping facilitate that social outing more regularly in a more affordable way. It could be dial a ride, or it could be other services that exist in that area. So good stuff. There's a few more, but I think I'll move on. I hope it got you guys to sort of contemplate the barriers that are in the way of obtaining those 3 goals for a disabled teenager. So we'll crack on a little bit more. And so here are, let's say, the 3 areas I'd already indicated, which were the physical, attitudinal and procedural or organisational barriers, and some broader thoughts that I'd sort of put together prior to having that little bit of a chat with you. So on a physical level, we've got access to buildings, which already came up, toilet facilities. So if there's not an accessible toilet, then using the loo would be difficult. Additional space for physio, that would be around in accessing school. So I know for myself, at primary there was I did my physio in the staff room, and at secondary school there was a whole building and a unit where we were able to go and have physio and standing frames and that whole world, but it was still part of that mainstream school, and unable to access the table or desk. So something as simple as not being able to get up to a table and write or use a computer would be a massive barrier in a physical sense. So then moving on to attitudinal, the attitude of the school. So obviously if the school is not as willing to sort of understand and look at a child's needs around their disability, then that attitude is going to hinder the progression of that child. If the business or public venue have negative views on disability, so I've put health and safety in around sort of being too risky and too difficult, and that under attitude is where it probably is that there isn't actually a health and safety problem, or it's risky or too difficult, but they're just things that are used to deflect and push back when they're just not really sort of comfortable or confident to be able to help find appropriate inclusive solutions. So that's about an individual having the confidence to know their needs and what is possible, and sometimes the confidence to push back onto perceived professionals like at a school and say, well, actually, is this really a health and safety issue, and let's discuss it and communicate it a bit more. Individual staff members, so Alison mentioned around the TAs. So absolutely, if staff members are maybe not forthcoming and wanting, I don't know if that was the individual situation for Alison, but as an example, if staff members aren't as willing to step forward and help in a sort of over and above the general sentiment, then that will be a barrier. And of peers as well. Obviously, if friends in the classroom or out of class, out socially, are not really sure of disability and what their other disabled peer needs, that's going to cause an attitudinal barrier. So very much attitudinal is around educating the relative sort of establishment and also friends and around as well. And then finally, under procedure, we've got how sometimes health and safety will be an issue, and then it's a matter of trying to overcome that without sort of compromising the school or the business. Employment application methods, so if looking for work experience, the company maybe has a test to be able to get in, but the disabled person would not be able to complete the test properly in the allotted time, then it would be reasonable adjustment for that test to be extended due to the person's disability, so that they can still be kind of marked and looked upon whether they're able to do the job and not have their disability affecting that decision. And then funding for personal support. So as I said, there's a whole webinar on accessing personal support, and that is so key for someone with a relatively severe physical disability, and that has a lot of procedural elements around it. So it'd always be ensuring that the local authority and social worker are understanding of the needs, and there isn't any sort of unfair barrier within that procedure towards that. And I've put as a kind of fourth part, but as a barrier, but it's not part of the social model of disability, and that's around self-perception. I think this is very, very apt during the teenage years. As I said earlier, I think as much as there are these external barriers in the world that do need to be overcome, it's also as much about having that drive and confidence and determination. Excuse the sirens outside, by the way. It's the A10 road in North London, so there's no riots kicking off at the moment. It's just the average London evening. I think they've passed by now. So yeah, I say self-perception is very, very important, and obviously in the teenage years, it's a very, very difficult time. I'll touch upon there's a couple of slides from my more personal experience, but I think you'll all agree that is a barrier in itself that only the individual can overcome by trying to stay positive and have that can-do attitude. So the things I've learnt during the school time, I've alluded to a few bits and bobs, certainly 2 weeks ago and a little bit earlier this evening. I hope you like the photo. It's quite an embarrassing one really, but I thought I'd share a little photo of my teenage years. I'd have been 14 at that time and I was quite a chubby teenager, as you can see. So I've put on the resources. That's not the specifics to learning, but it's, again, I'd like you to also apply those as solutions towards your individual circumstances, looking to achieve the goals within school and overcoming the barriers. But I say for me, I think, overall school was a very positive experience. I think my mum and dad were a big part of that. They were always pushing that I should be included and have the right support. For those that were here 2 weeks ago, you remember that while I went to the local primary, I didn't go to the local secondary school because it wasn't accessible, despite a long campaign to try and have that overturned. So that's a situation where things don't always work out as planned, and that will happen. But I then went on a bus half an hour away with 3 other disabled students, and we became very good friends, and it was good having that peer-to-peer support of someone who was disabled, because obviously I didn't feel like I was the only one with a disability having the worries and fears that I had during those times. That was a positive. And then equally, when I got to school, I was the only disabled person in my class, so I was still very much included, and we talked about the access to physio and standing frames and everything like that. So school was generally, a very good balance, and I was able to get my GCSEs and my A-levels there. And then looking down those resources, had the right people, had the right technology, had the right funding. So it's sort of getting all the different ducks lined up and knocking them down gradually, and that will sometimes take years, as we'll talk about on the independent living goals in 2 weeks as well. But while it does take its time, it is very much worth it, and to have that time to plan it out and look at it a bit more strategically, as I'm trying to do here, it hopefully gives you that awareness that even when things are difficult and things won't always go right, there's always a way to get there in the end. And so then looking at the things socially, so Vicky brought up a very good point about being able to get out and socially integrate and be included with friends. And I think because all my original friends where I lived were at a different school, and because my school friends lived farther away, it was quite difficult to actually have that social interaction easily. And then, as we mentioned, with travel being difficult and my personal needs being quite high around needing help with the toilet and things like that, it did make it very, very tricky. But I think, looking at people on the resources, the biggest part for me in the teenage years was having 1 or 2 very good friends that were, very aware of my disability, and they'd probably grown up with me a bit as well. But I'm sure there were times where I, maybe with my parents, would have talked to my friends about those needs, so they understood it, and then over time it became second nature that they were happy and willing and able to support me, so that I didn't need an adult there. I guess the other way is if the needs are so high or there aren't any friends that are happy to do that, then it might be more about not having sort of mum and dad in inverted commas there, but maybe it would be a personal assistant, but of a younger age, or even if it's just more of a neutral person that can be around to support if and when needed. So that's very much up to you guys to consider and work through, but some general ideas there. I think one other thing to mention, I've sort of alluded again to the sort of self-perception, but those years are crazy years where you're coming to terms with who you are and who you want to be. Hormones are running wild, thinking about relationships as well, and that whole world comes into play. And I think another key part is that if you're a disabled teenager, you acknowledge that that is difficult, and that a lot of people go through that, and try and communicate that to your mum or dad or to your friends, and equally as a parent that you're open to communicating, because going through puberty is always a funny time for everyone. I think having a disability, it's a little bit more complicated too. So there's a few sort of aspects to consider, and again, if you want to kind of pick my brains a bit more around that, then by all means at the end we can do that on the questions. But I think that probably sums up the social aspect of my teenage years. I just have one really funny story really, where I wanted to go to a nightclub when I was about 18, about half an hour away, and the only way I could go and come back was if Mum would drop me off and pick me up. And this was before I drove. Obviously I now drive a adapted car through Motability, but we had this really old clapped out vehicle that looked like a kebab van, with a ramp at the back. And bless them, my mum and my sister, who was 5 years younger, so she was about 13, came out at 2 in the morning to collect me from this nightclub, with all these drunk teenagers sort of stumbling around where they drove into this car park. And bless them, they both picked me up and enabled me to go out and have that great experience and that great night. And I think the overall moral of that really is that I would have wanted to do those kind of things more than I could, but it wasn't possible. And I know that for my mum it was a big compromise to come out the times that she did do it. So it's sort of also that communication and balancing act really around sort of facilitating those experiences as a parent, but as a disabled teenager realising that your mum and dad aren't superheroes, and that there will be limits to the amount they can facilitate you to be included. So a lot of balancing acts I think throughout these years going on. So that picture there isn't me in my teenage years. That's probably a couple of months ago, doing some work from home. And in fact, that's where I'm sat at the moment, talking to you from my laptop with my fridge behind me. But in terms of work experience, I mentioned how I had done some sort of about afternoon a week during one of my summer holidays at the estate agents, having gone in. And I'd also worked at a leisure centre when I was about 16, 17, working at a kids club, and doing some of the sort of admin as well. And then I did a summer placement through the civil service, which I actually applied for and had to go for interviews. And again, it wasn't paid, but really all of these different aspects of work experience taught me, the issues that come into play when applying for and gaining any form of employment. And that was when I wasn't actually looking to be paid for it as well. It was much more voluntary. So it was massively helpful general work experience, and again with the additional needs of having a disability. But I think really it's about those, and we'll look a bit at how all of this provides a foundation. But in having that general experience and going through some difficult times doing that, it was very much worthwhile, because I then felt more confident and knowledgeable about how to approach full employment, which we'll look at in independent living. So an employer would see me as someone that knew a bit more about the world of work. And it also, as anyone else, it gives you those sort of foundations and stepping stones into paid employment in a general way. So it's sort of, I think it's always, we look at this, taking a normal situation but factoring in the extra additional needs of a disability and then just working through it. But it's all about the work experience, having that confidence to push on and give yourself the best opportunity of finding work. And obviously that's partly a social thing too, because all my friends were doing work experience during those days as well. So it was another inclusion part on a social front. So as I said, this was the perfect foundations. If you can have those three goals cracked, where as much inclusion as possible is fulfilled, but with the right needs in socially, educationally, and work experience, then the next step on that diamond is going to be so much easier. As I said, there's another interactive part, so I'm going to launch this and hopefully forget to or won't forget to turn it off afterwards. So basically what you need to do is click on one of the three answers of the poll, and we'll see what you guys think is I'll launch it now. Here we go. It should be launched. There we go. So which aspect of the teenage years do you think is most difficult? So having discussed it all as we just have, and then applying it to your circumstances and your world, it'd be interesting to see what you all think. I'll just give you a few seconds to all click on it. Okay, I think all the results are in. I'll just share it. There we go. So as you can see, pretty unanimous that social inclusion is the most difficult, and I think that echoes a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the younger years and we didn't look at work experience, it was just social inclusion and education. There was a feeling that the problems and the barriers around education and now work experience can be complex, but with a bit of more thought and effort and everything, they can definitely be more, I think because they're more tangible, they can be overcome. Whereas I think looking at social inclusion, definitely applying my sort of personal experiences as well, there's more intangible, it's sort of softer things that are going on. It's about relationships and stereotypes and perceptions and attitudes, which maybe are a bit harder to overcome and take longer. And as I say, I hope my general story can prove that they can be overcome and there is a way. But I think it's about taking as many of the tangibles as is possible, but then also breaking it down as well. We've got back online now. I can rest easily that you can see the rest of it. But yes, equally that it might take a bit longer for other friendships to form that can become part of those solutions, like the way my friends would assist me if we had a day out to the cinema, or whether it be recruiting personal assistants or buddies that are able to sort of fill that gap where the need is covered, but maybe mum and dad don't need to come along every time. So I know from a parent's point of view that's quite difficult to let go. I mean, even when I was in my 20s, my mum found it very, very hard for me to move off to London, even when I'd been away at university, in fact. So there's a other whole world there as well. So it sort of brings us around to a bit of a conclusion, really, which is good timing. So we've covered the diamond theory. So if you haven't come across that, feel free to download it on my blog. And if you haven't, feel free to subscribe to that for my general weekly articles as well. I'll be popping the New York video up at the weekend, which will be quite a lively affair. We looked at how the theory applied to this topic, so the 3 goals specifically to the teenage years. We considered the barriers that were relevant to you, and you wrote those in the chat box. And then hopefully, using some of my experiences and bounding around some ideas, you've also found some solutions for education, work experiencing and socialising. So next we've got question and answer session. So I think might be a matter of as I said, a particular question you want to ask about your situation, and I'll do my best to answer it, and if not, we'll refer it to scope response as well. But also I'm always wary that as much as I try to cover everything, it's very difficult to cover lots and lots of years of things that went on. I worry sometimes I make it all sound a little bit too easy or a little bit too simple, when in fact there were periods that were very hard and challenging and took a long time to get through, and I can't sort of confirm that part enough. So if you just want to sort of double check things or clarify things as well, then by all means do right away. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to have a bit of a think. I'm going to have a quick swig of water as well, actually. But get typing in that chat box for questions, clarifications, or even additional points that you want to make. It'd be good to hear what your thoughts are on it, if you disagree with anything I've said, or just to add things to the points I've made. That would be great as well, and then we can share it around with each other. But I'm just going to have a quick swig of some H2O. Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming in. Say, don't be shy. It's a bit quieter tonight than 2 weeks ago on the chat box typing front. So do, get involved and don't be shy. And even if it's just echoing anything I've said or general thoughts to drop in, then just type it in the chat box and I'll share it out with the group as well. So don't hold back. So John is saying here around education, how I coped with my exams. I assume that's around the whole, was I able to write or do it within the time? It sort of exampled it there. A bit like I mentioned actually with the testing earlier on for employment, it would be much the same really. So the way that I talked about, if there was a test for a job and a person might need more time, that was very much the case for me when I was doing my exams at school as well. So I was able to use a computer if I needed to when everyone else would handwrite. I had access to someone called an amanuensis. I have no idea where that name actually comes from. So if anyone does, again, feel free to drop it in. But basically that's a scribe. So if I couldn't handwrite myself or type at all or quick enough and didn't have access to speech recognition and all those other options, there was also the opportunity to have a person in the exam with me who I was then able to use to write up what I needed to do for the exam. And I did have, I think it was 25% extra time. I don't know if it was 25% or 50%. It was quite a long time ago now. But yeah, because essentially my disability meant that I couldn't get through all my exam questions quick enough. That then there was those provisions allowed that enabled me to be able to complete them fairly and, to actually look at my ability to answer the questions rather than my disability hindering me. So there's some general sentiments around inclusion with exams and schooling there. Someone was saying, how did I feel having so I'm just reading it through. Okay, yeah, having my peers supporting with personal care. Another good question, actually. Yeah, but I suppose it sort of happened over a long time. The main couple of people that I can remember once we were in our teenage years supporting me if we went to the cinema or shopping or off to football, whatever it might have been, being able to support my physical needs. I'd known them probably over 10 years from reception at school. So I guess it sort of just gradually happened over time. And it might have even been that we'd sort of sat down and said, look, be good to go there, but I need these additional needs and support. And they probably said, well, I could help you. And I probably would have said, well, are you sure? It might be a bit awkward or embarrassing for both of us. And they'll have sort of said, well, don't be stupid. You're my best mate and I don't mind helping you. So as much as I can't remember the specific moment or conversation, looking back on those types of things, I'm sure that's broadly the way things would have gone down over time. I think it's very rarely this sort of massive overarching moment where it comes to a head and it's this awkward conversation, and as such it's probably more just being communicative and dealing with things as they come up, and over time that becomes more and more easy. It's interesting, I was thinking about relationships when I mentioned it earlier, and I've on the diamond, I think I didn't mention it when I gave the summary, but it wasn't a goal in itself. I had it as a line going up to the right hand side of it. I'll actually scroll back to show you. If I can get this to work, there we go. So yeah, you can see on the right hand side it says relationships. Now originally I thought whether that would be a goal that everyone would want in a generic sense, to be in a relationship and end up married and having families or whatever it might be, as a very broad brush approach. But the reason that I didn't make it a goal in itself is because I realised that relationships are more than sort of the love aspect and finding a partner aspect. Relationships with friends and families and professionals are so important. So I think that that is a goal in itself, but it's out of the diamond, and therefore it doesn't fit just into the teenage years and just into adulthood. But I think, you know, the social inclusion aspect of the teenage years would also, from memory, include certain relationship aspects too, in the love sense. And so I can definitely draw on some experience because someone's just asked a little question there about it. And again, that, you know, having sort of discussed how when friendships were formed and people helped me in more and more ways relating to my disability, I can remember certainly with my girlfriend at university, where while it would have started as an everyday getting to know someone, you know, getting closer and ending up together, there definitely would have been conversations around the additional needs that I have and what she was willing or not willing to do, and where if she wasn't, then I would still need my personal assistance. So I just thought I'd, yeah, throw that out generally as well, that while it's not a goal within the teenage years, it definitely is another aspect to consider. And certainly during those years, I remember saying to my mum, you know, oh, will a girl ever accept me with my disability and, you know, want to love me, and all those kind of sort of almost sounds childish now, but I know how real and true that was at the time. And, you know, I know my mum always just said, well, yeah, at the end of the day, people fall in love when they fall in love, and they'll accept you for who you are. So that kind of conversation went on and should go on. But equally, it's good to acknowledge those doubts and worries that someone will have. So if anyone has any more confidential, private thoughts or questions on that, by all means, yeah, give me a shout. And as, yeah, if I can't help, I know a few people at Scope that would be able to as well. So I think we're drawing to a bit of a close actually. The questions haven't been as thick and fast as a couple of weeks ago, so I'll take that as a sign that the presentation delivery covered everything that you needed to know. So Vicky's just saying relationships are so important throughout life for everyone, for disabled people even more. Absolutely. I think while I would never say I am dependent, you know, I'm fully independent, there definitely are lots of people in my life that help underpin and support me to be independent, and those relationships with them are so important. And then equally, just as much as we said with the love aspects of relationships, I think disabled people can have more worries and concerns, and it can also become more of a taboo subject as well. So I think that's very much about, you know, never suppressing and ignoring thoughts about that. Always be willing to talk about it and share it with people that you trust, and, you know, can be confidential obviously, but never bury those thoughts. They're very important to acknowledge and try to work through and overcome. So thank you for that, Vicky. It's good to hear my thoughts echoed. So as I say, I think that probably is the end. If anything else pops into your heads afterwards, then you've got my contact details on the screen. If you have something very much more impairment specific, and then yeah, you can head off and then give Scope Response a call another time as well. So I shall leave it there and sign off. I'll send the videos through as well once I've had a chance to sort those out. It's been a bit of a crazy couple of weeks for me. So I was in New York last week. We landed Monday, and then yesterday I was doing some filming for BBC London for an Inside Out documentary, which was very full on. I had a couple of webinars today. I'm back filming tomorrow and delivering a keynote speech on Friday. So it's been a crazy couple of weeks. But I say, when I get the chance to cut the videos, I'll email those out, and then yeah, I'll hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time for Independent Living Part 1. But thank you for joining and signing on, and I hope this is all helpful for you. Take care, bye bye.